Running a sandbox campaign can be one of the most rewarding things you do as a dungeon master. However, the player freedom that makes this style of campaign so much fun also makes it a daunting prospect for many. How, if the players can go anywhere and do anything, do you even begin to prepare for a session, much less an entire campaign? Hey everybody, and welcome to Arcran's Arcanum. I'm Arcran, and today we're talking about something that's been requested a few times: how to run a sandbox style game. Fortunately, my home game is sandbox style, so I have a bit of experience with this, and I'm going to be running through 3 things that I have found the most success with in running a sandbox game. These strategies are keeping your sandbox small, Crossroads Sessions, and what is and is not worth preparing for your sandbox. First off, let's define what exactly a sandbox style game is. In general, sandbox games are largely driven by the player's choices and what they choose to pursue. Where they go, who they talk to, and how the story unfolds are all decided by the players and influenced by their actions, as opposed to a pre-written module or story that expects the players to go down a specific path and do things a specific way. As a simple analogy, a sandbox campaign is similar to Skyrim, where your players can go anywhere, do anything, and what quests they pursue are entirely up to them. A more traditional campaign might look more like a Pokemon game, where your players follow a fairly linear story step by step with very little room for variance. Sandbox campaigns do still frequently have overarching stories, but what that story looks like is frequently shaped by your players' actions and what they engage with, as opposed to what you prepare ahead of time. Many DMs assume that to run a sandbox game, they need an entire fleshed out world with full maps, pages of lore, and the historical lineages of every single country. Fortunately, unless you're an aspiring author, you need far less preparation than that, especially if you make use of our first strategy, keeping your sandbox small. Many DMs imagine their entire world as one giant sandbox that all needs to be prepared at once, when in reality, you only really need a sandbox big enough for your players to play in. Once your players have completed everything they're interested in one sandbox, they'll move on to the next. You should imagine your world as a series of small sandboxes that your players move between rather than one giant one, as that breaks it down into bite-sized tasks that are much easier to prepare and will help you keep your sanity. We'll get into what exactly a successful sandbox needs later in the video, but at the start of the campaign, you only need a few sandboxes. One fairly well-developed one for where the campaign is starting, and the blueprints or outlines of the sandboxes connected to your players' backstories. At the start of a campaign, these are the only things your players have interacted with, and as such are the only things they likely care about in the world. By focusing on these sandboxes, you can save yourself a lot of time and make sure that your preparation is going into things that you know your players are going to be interested and invested in, even if it's a little bit later down the line. You're absolutely free to prepare more, but these are the sandboxes that matter to your players and are the ones most worth preparing for. As a side note, try to get some input from your players as you work on developing the sandboxes related to their backstory. This is going to offload a little bit of the work from you, and also is going to ensure that when your players finally get to engage with their backstory, they're going to be a bit more invested because they had a hand in creating what it looks like in the world. Now, you might be wondering how with these smaller sandboxes, we maintain a sense of player freedom and the ability to go anywhere and do anything. The answer lies in a little bit of player psychology. As soon as your players start on a task, they're likely to see it through to the finish before they do something radically different. If your players have decided to hunt down a serial killing werewolf, they're unlikely to focus on another mission in very much depth until that werewolf is either behind bars or more likely just in the ground. This means that once you get your players invested in an adventure, you probably just need the sandbox that adventure lives in until it ends. But what do you do when that adventure ends and your players start looking for the next great thing? This brings us to our second strategy, the Crossroads Session, named as such because the players have a wide array of paths in front of them and can take whichever they choose. Because we're making use of smaller sandboxes, preparing the sessions between those sandboxes take a bit more work. To continue the analogy, for a Crossroads session, you're going to need to prep the first few feet of every road taking you to a new sandbox. Each of these paths should be a plot hook, or the first little bit of an adventure that pulls players further in. The quest doesn't need to be fully created at this point, you just need the very quick 1 or 2 sentence summary that's going to get your players interested in it. How to make a good plot hook could be a video of its own, but for a sandbox style game, a good plot hook depends very heavily on how self-driven your players are. For very self-driven groups, a map with points of interest marked might be enough to keep them busy for a very long time. For other groups that need a bit more of a nudge, you might need more concrete, conventional plot hooks such as a job board or an adventurer's guild that gives out quests. For a self-driven and observant group, you can use very subtle plot hooks, such as a previously thriving city becoming a bit more worn down in a very short period of time, which might prompt them to investigate what has happened here. To make sure your Crossroads sessions are a success, you need to make sure you provide plot hooks that your players are likely to engage with. The best plot hooks either engage with a player's backstory, offer considerable rewards such as a magic item, or are just funny enough that your players will go for it no matter what. When you prepare a Crossroads session, make sure that you provide a few hooks that check one of those 3 boxes, otherwise your party might flounder without any real path forward as they don't have any hooks that feel particularly engaging to them. With that, we have the mission statement for our Crossroads sessions. Provide a few paths forward and figure out which one your players are going to go down. However, we still have to prepare for the actual session itself, besides simply providing plot hooks. What a Crossroads session looks like will vary from table to table depending on what your players find interesting, but in general, I've found that Crossroads sessions that take place in a player's home city tend to be much more successful. Players often have NPCs they like to interact with or tasks they need to accomplish in this location, which means you have an easy supply of content to make use of for a Crossroads session. It's also useful to provide a low-stakes activity that your party can participate in during a Crossroads session. In my own campaign, most Crossroads sessions coincidentally fall on a holiday in the campaign setting, which means there are festivals, balls, and other activities to keep your players busy and give them some low-stakes RP they can enjoy themselves with. These are also great ways to organically introduce plot hooks with travelers from far-off lands and gossip running rampant at these giant events. Just remember that the point of a Crossroads session is to figure out where your players are going to go next so you can prepare accordingly. If you don't have a clear idea of that at the end of a session, simply ask your players and try to get a common consensus so you can prepare the next chunk of the story. It can feel a bit like trying to herd cats, but getting a clear answer out of your players is incredibly important and makes your job as the dungeon master much easier. As a campaign progresses, you'll likely have less and less need of these Crossroads sessions. Your players will have recurring villains or plots that they know they want to engage with, and you won't need to really throw new plot hooks at them. Your players know what they are interested in and will continue to pursue it. At this point, Crossroads sessions get replaced with simply communicating with your players. As you approach the end of an adventure, at the end of a session, simply ask your players what they want to do next so you can start preparing accordingly. Plans change, and it's no guarantee that that's what your players will do next, but it should cut down on the number of surprises significantly. Even if your players don't pursue the exact task they outlined, it's still likely to be useful further down the line as it's something they're interested in and are likely to return to. With that, let's move on to our third strategy, which is simply how to prepare a sandbox. We want to keep our sandboxes flexible enough that our players have absolute freedom to do whatever they want, but we want enough structure that events are going to happen even without the players' input. First off is the location. Whether this be a town, city, or dungeon, you should have a good idea of the general area. If this is a place that your players have been to in the past, you're likely done with this step. The most important things to prepare for a location are a general sense of its aesthetic so that you can easily improvise descriptions of buildings and things like that, the locations and social structures important to the current quest that the players are on, and the name of a couple taverns just because adventurers always seem to end up at those. If you're expecting a dungeon crawl, you should also prep the dungeon itself, but I suggest holding off on that until your players are fairly close to arriving at the dungeon, just in case they throw any curveballs your way. The most important thing is to focus your preparation on the parts of the location that your players are actually going to interact with. If your players are going to the sewers to hunt a monster, you don't need to worry about preparing the palace or the noble structure of the city, but you might want to give some thought to the Thieves Guild because that's something they could potentially encounter in a sewer. Next, and what I feel is the most important part of preparing a successful sandbox, is that you don't want to prepare a plot or a story. Instead, focus your preparation on NPCs that are all trying to achieve something. It's an important reframing, as if you prepare a story and your players do something unexpected, it can be difficult to improvise an appropriate response. However, if you prepare NPCs that all have their own goals and different things driving them, it's much easier to think about how that NPC is going to react to the situation and improvise accordingly. When preparing an NPC, the things you're going to want to define are their goal, or what they're trying to achieve, their personality, and their capabilities and resources. An NPC's goal is simply what they are trying to achieve, whether that be simply making a fortune or killing the king. It's going to inform everything they do, as all of their actions should be taking them closer to this goal. It will also inform how the NPC interacts with the players, as anything the players can offer that will move that NPC closer to their goal is going to be of immense interest to them. The NPC's personality is similarly useful, as it will also inform how they interact with the players. This doesn't need to be anything horrifically complex. It can be simply that they are a grumpy NPC, or they are a desperate NPC. This is both a good touchstone for how to roleplay an NPC, as well as a useful tool to determine exactly how they will respond when the players get in between them and their goal. A brash NPC might try to handle the situation right there on the spot, while a more conniving or calculated NPC might wait for the opportune moment to strike. An NPC's resources and capabilities are very similar, and they will both inform how that NPC pursues their goal. I kind of think of capabilities as what the NPC can do themselves, and resources as things that they can call in to help them. An NPC that can use magic has that as a capability, whereas an NPC that is the captain of the guard has the guard itself as a resource. A skilled spellcaster, a cunning merchant, or a well-connected noble are all going to pursue their goals in different ways, and your players are likely to interact with them in different ways. Note that in general, this preparation doesn't mean making a stat block for an NPC. In most cases, that's going to be wasted work. I suggest only really bothering with a stat block when you expect your players to fight an NPC in the near future. How many NPCs you need to create will depend mostly on the adventure itself. A political intrigue story will need far more NPCs than a simple monster hunt. Still, it's a useful exercise even for those less personal missions, simply because it's going to make your NPCs much more believable and much more engaging. The final bit of preparation that I like to do before a sandbox is to create a timeline of the adventure, which represents when key events are going to happen without any player intervention. Like plotting out key NPCs, this is simply another tool to make improvising much easier, as well as to help make our sandbox feel more alive. When events happen with minimal player input, the sandbox feels much more real, and your players' choices feel like they have much more weight to them. As your players interact with the sandbox, their successes and failures will likely influence this timeline. If they're drawing a lot of attention and making a lot of noise, maybe NPCs accelerate their plans out of fear of the players interfering. At the same time, if your players are successfully foiling smaller plots, maybe it delays an NPC's plot by a little bit longer so your players have more time to stop it. The final bonus goal that you can do while preparing your sandbox is to think of future plot hooks that you can start to seed in at the end of an adventure. This isn't necessary, but it can make your world feel a bit more organic and cohesive, as well as somewhat remove the need for Crossroads Sessions. After all, if your players find a good plot hook pointing towards one of their backstories towards the end of one adventure, they're likely to pursue that hook next. Those are the core principles that I find useful when preparing a sandbox. It's quite a bit of upfront work, but if done right, this preparation should carry you through the entire arc with minimal additional work. These tools won't prepare you for every eventuality. Players are inherently chaotic creatures after all, but it will put you in a much better spot to improvise a good story and keep things moving, which is the most important part of a game. With that, I have a few quick tips to make running your sandboxes even easier. The first is to write down everything. No matter how well you prepare, you're going to be forced to improvise names, places, and a million other things. If you keep good notes, you can return to things that you improvised later down the line to flesh them out more and make it seem like that NPC you made up on the spot was planned all along. The second is to talk to your players about what they want to do. If there's ever a question of what they're going to do with their next session, make sure to take some time and ask to simply get an idea of where they're headed next. If you don't talk to your players when you're not sure what they're going to do next, it becomes much harder to prepare accordingly. Even if you do ask, your players are still going to surprise you, but that simple act of planning makes the eventual improv much easier to pull off. Finally, as you run your own sandbox game, you're likely to develop your own technique for preparation that might not necessarily be what's in this video, and that's fine. This is simply what I use to prepare and is a good jumping off point, but as you become a more experienced dungeon master, you're likely to develop your own technique. And with that final tip, we're done. If you have any suggestions for a future video or questions about how to prepare for a sandbox, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, thanks for stopping by the Arcanum and have a great day.